So this podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of our title sponsor, Manulife, and today's presenting sponsor, BDC. These organizations are committed to supporting our local economy and small businesses. It is currently BDC Small Business Week from October 20th to 26th, and which is an annual celebration of entrepreneurship and small business that BDC has been organizing for over 45 years. And so we're pleased to continue this series. I'm excited to introduce today's guest on the Behind the Business podcast. Joining me is Glen Smyth of AppleFlats. And so thanks very much for taking the time out of your schedule today to join us.
Thanks, Ian. Happy to be here.
Good stuff. Okay, so tell us a little bit about the business. I mean, because I think there's the journey is part of what we want to get to, and how BDC and others supported that journey. But tell us about AppleFlats. What is it, and explain the business to our viewers.
The concept of the business is very, very simple. We're taking a type of apple that used to grow wild here in Canada and is going extinct, and instead we're trying to commercialize that. So if we can show there are dollars to be made on this apple, then our hope is that other orchards, both in the region and throughout the country, will then plant crab apples of their own, preserving the species for future generations through that commercialization process. So the thesis for this business is extremely simple.
I mean, I grew up, I remember crab apples as being a thing. I didn't realize it was going extinct. Talk a little bit about the concept for the business. I mean, so it's one thing. I imagine you realized they were going extinct, but was it to save the crab apple species, or like, do you think is there a possibility of making some money in doing it?
Well, we're hoping for both. We are hoping to make money at the end of this travel, but the short answer is we had this hypothesis, both my brother and I, was that people would show up every day if their livelihood depended on it to keep something around. And so that was our thought process, is if we could have people's full-time jobs depend on this apple, then they're going to show up every day and defend that this apple has a right to be here. And that was why we wanted to commercialize it rather than running it as a not-for-profit or a charity. The principle here was, if you can show that there's dollars, people will chase those dollars, and therefore the apple itself can be enshrined through that, and it has a right to continue to exist.
Okay, so you went to Carleton University. I think you and I both very impressive political scientist degrees, but I imagine you did not go to Carleton for political science in order to start a business with crab apples. So maybe draw that line, because I think you started the business right out of university or college or university, and it is a family business. So talk a little bit about that process, right? I mean, most of us get a job, our first job. You started a business right out of your. So describe how that happened, and then we'll dig in a little more into the detail.
So the transition there is actually relatively simple. So for my last 2 years of university, I didn't find school particularly complicated. So I would register for my courses, and then I would actually fly out at the end of my first week of school to Alberta and just south of Alaska to work in the oil field with my brother. And we did that for about 2 years. So every year I would just fly home for exams, and then the next semester I'd go to my first class for each day. Off I go, come back.
Yeah.
And so when we had finished up our degree at that point in time, we had been experimenting with this apple because we had a one tree on our front property. And we had sold some jelly for fun. It was, a few $100s. We really didn't think anything of it. And it was only because a handful of stores asked to buy more that it led us down this research path just as I had finished university, saying, well, why can I not buy more of this apple? That seems pretty abnormal. If I want to go and buy more strawberries or blueberries, unless I'm McDonald's, I can buy as many of these things as I want. It's a question of how much money I have. But for some reason, this tiny apple couldn't be purchased. And that was a really interesting question that we spent about 6 months kind of haphazardly looking for. And I did work in tech for about 6 months after university at that point as we were doing this research. And then when we realized this apple actually is disappearing, that was the point where we figured we should probably do something about this, because apparently for the last 30 years, no one else has been paying attention. So here's an opportunity for somebody to pay attention, which we figured was us.
So you and your brother, it's a family-owned business, startup, relatively new. You had to learn the business from, and talk a little bit about things like harvesting the apples. You know, you planted other trees, you've now got orchards, but all of those things would have been, you know, on the to-do list that you had to learn about because you didn't, you know, there was no business. It's created out of whole cloth, so to speak.
Yeah, in this case, it's a really good example of having the optimism of a college student and not the wisdom of a career in how we did this. Because when we started, what we figured was we'll sell a few $100,000 worth of crab apples. Not a big deal. Can't be that complicated. That's really all we need. And what we really underestimated was how good humans and growers are in this area. So to be competitive, we really underestimated that. And we also underestimated the size and scale of apples as an industry, as an entity. And so when we started the business, we went out and started handpicking our apples the same way. We had one tree. We figured, maybe we need a handful more trees. And we figured we would need to plant an orchard, which we did. And by an orchard, I mean 11 trees that we successfully grafted in our first year. The problem at that point is you have a catch-22, which is you need apples to demonstrate a business, but you need a business to justify spending thousands of dollars to plant an orchard. And so we had this kind of catch-22, and we solved it in two ways. So the first one was we realized, as we discovered the apple was disappearing, how do you grow crab apples? And then we realized no one actually has the answer to that. So, okay, we'll figure that out. That can't be that complicated. Wrong. Very complicated. But we realized we needed apples at the same time. And so what we started doing is going and picking front yards, backyards, community centers, hospitals, originally throughout Kitchener-Waterloo, and then including Guelph and London, and it's kind of grown from there over the years. But we needed to have apples to generate a business to justify planting an orchard of itself and giving our trees time to actually grow and prosper. So we now almost certainly do the largest urban harvest in the world. We're harvesting about 2,500 trees across all of southwestern Ontario from about 650 sites, including dozens throughout Kitchener-Waterloo, Guelph, London, and surrounding regions. And that takes the pressure off of our original home orchard to allow us to experiment with how do you prune them? How much fertilizer do you use? Do you grow them 10 feet apart? Do you grow them 8 feet apart? Do you grow them 20 feet apart? How do you actually grow these things efficiently? And us not having to put a lot of pressure on that young orchard to produce a lot of fruit right away, allow us to do things the right way.
Okay. So the theme of BDC's Small Business Week is the power of small and defying the odds. I think you're a poster child for both, which is the power of small and the relationships you build to have that many trees across, which obviously means you've got a whole bunch of partners, whether they're, however you describe them, you got lots of partners. So being resilient, a small business, that's what they have to do, startups in particular. And because you face challenges every day, you got to kind of work your way through those. So maybe pick one of those challenges that you've faced recently. And it was a relatively new business, I guess I would say, since inception. What's one of those things that you kind of, a challenge that you looked at, you said, geez, this could be a game break or a deal breaker. And how did you overcome it?
So the first thing I would answer with that is I'm going to give you a business solution that is probably more applicable to most people. I'm going to give you a really unique AppleFlats answer. So the business solution is a really good example of Sobeys. So when we first started, Sobeys Look for Local program was just in its infancy. And what we did is we went around to different Sobeys and gauged the interest level of the different Sobeys managers and discovered which Sobeys were franchised and which ones were corporate.
Yep.
And so then we would work with the corporate managers that were more in favor of local and the franchisees who were in favor of local with listing our products in order to then go to head office and say, hey, we can demonstrate that we can actually sell here. And what ended up happening over our first 18 months is we went from 1 store to 5 stores to 10 stores, and then ended up we had enough of the sales volume that Sobeys said, fine, you win. You can have as many of the Sobeys in the province as you want. Foodlands as well.
Yeah.
And so it's a good example of what you're actually hunting for is depth. You want to be really good at one thing, in this case, finding chinks in Sobeys listing process to be able to get where you needed to go. And I think that's probably applicable for every single business. A lot of times, people that I talk to, they want to do a service over here, they want to do a service over here. And the answer is you want to be extremely good at one thing, and all those follow-on services are going to come naturally without a whole lot of effort after that first original move. So that's part number one. The second kind of partner that I think is really important for us, probably unique to AppleFlats, is our Urban Harvest partners. So a good example would be the University of Waterloo. We have a number of other universities that work with us, but U of W has been fantastic. They have our trees on their property. Their ability to give us access to harvest them, to pull that fruit, to work on campus, to work around their students, to work around their grounds crew, to get information from their grounds crew to make sure that these trees are safe, they are healthy, they're happy, they're not sprayed, they're not damaged. Those are really integral relationships for us, because not only do they allow us to then create products, but they also give us this huge wealth of information that most businesses typically don't have. When you start a business, you have from the inception date onwards as your record keeping, and many of these other older institutions, they actually have records that go back tens or dozens of, maybe not hundreds, but tens of years.
Yeah.
And we can actually get all of that information that help us inform the decisions that we make on our orchard today. So we can actually go back and say, well, in University of Waterloo, what did they prune their trees in 2005, long before we ever started this business? Most businesses don't have that advantage. So that is really helpful for us.
Okay, so I want to come to a couple of things, but I'm going to start with the relationship you've developed with BDC. You have your traditional banking, or your I would say big bank or big credit union. BDC is a complementary lender. They have I'm always astounded by the level of consulting services they have that are very useful for entrepreneurs. So talk about you started your business. We'll come back to some of the detail, some of the other lessons, but you developed this relationship with BDC. How have they been able to support you in this venture of sort of basically from inception and an idea and, what do you say, couple $100 in one tree to an actual viable business? How do they help you along that way?
So the BDC, especially on the capital side, has been really integral for inflection points and for testing our growth assumptions. So I'm going to explain exactly what I mean. When we originally launched our products, we had identified hard cider and soda as the two key categories that we actually wanted to be in. At the time when we launched, there wasn't enough apples to do that. It just wasn't possible. So as time goes by, we finally are able to actually have enough apples to do that. We're ready to actually go ahead and make that launch. And so what we do is we discuss with BDC at a really good inflection point to transition us from legacy products into the current products. And they're fantastic at providing that small gap where we're really confident in what we're doing, but they're not actually designed to hold our hand in the way that, let's say, one of the big five banks or one of the larger credit unions is going to do daily banking. It's not what the BDC is for us. But they're fantastic at moving quickly. They're fantastic at providing those inflection points. Again, a really good example of this, again, is just a couple of months ago. We went from having one soda to 3 different flavors. That's a really big jump. It's much easier to go from 1 to 2 and go slower in the growth. But we had this assumption that if we had 2 flavors, it would sell, instead of selling a little bit better, it would sell 50% better. If we have 3 flavors, it would sell 75% better. They wouldn't cannibalize each other.
Right.
And the BDC was able to move fast enough to really work with us and bring those products to market. And we have, and that's what's really exciting. So they're fantastic at those key inflection points without getting bogged down in the minutia of day to day.
Okay, so building on that, successful entrepreneurs are resourceful. You open, you collaborate with partners, and we've talked about that. You've got your site partners, or where your trees are located. So you have partners, and there's always challenges along the way. When you face those bigger challenges or those roadblocks to your growth, um, having connections, BDC one of them, but probably other business advisors that you have, people that you know. And what I constantly am astounded by is people ask for help from friends or from mentors, and people are always there to help. So maybe talk about that your network and having those connections and using your trusted partners to kind of get over those obstacles.
So, at least in our experience so far, the real key value of the trusted partners is what we've already talked about here with allowing us to go and harvest in ways that we haven't before. So that one's really valuable. The other really big thing that has been really helpful is allowing other pieces of expertise that you wouldn't necessarily think are really valuable being particularly valuable. So, for example, one of the things that we spent years doing incorrectly was a sampling program. Well, I'm not going to spend tons of time diving into that, but the short answer is we sampled a lot. We handed out hundreds of thousands of samples to people all across the province, centered here in Waterloo, and we were not seeing the uptick that we were anticipating. Mm-hmm. A lot of industry experts, a lot of everything that we could read said sample, sample, sample. It's how people interact with your brand. And we were not seeing uptick from that. And so we then went out. I had talked to other people that I previously had worked with, and we built a data feedback loop using some software, which again, skill sets that you would normally associate with agriculture, and allowed us to actually feed in the sales data, the sampling data, for it to spit out what was fundamentally a key metric of whether or not this works for us. And the answer was it didn't. So we ended up entirely canceling that program and moving to something else that we found was actually going to be a lot more effective use of the resources. So the network is really important in the sense that you're going to need skills that you are not going to have. It is impossible in today's day and age for any entrepreneur, even a small team, to be extremely well versed in everything that a business needs. It's unrealistic to assume that an accountant is going to be a fantastic sales rep, is going to be able to design a website, is going to be able to pack orders or find logistics partners or navigate the intricacies of exporting products.
I like the example you just used, because you talked about an example of the advice that you got to stop doing something, not what's the next new thing, is saying this is not working. How do we, and getting that advice and saying, no, you're right, that isn't right, or maybe you should try something different. So let me spin this or turn that slightly and say, if you're giving some advice to others, I'm saying obviously BDC, and again, the advisory services they have, I think they got 12 or 13 themes: HR, finance, succession plan. I mean, they've got all of the pieces for any entrepreneur at various stages along the way. So that's one partner. Maybe you have a lawyer or accountant or bookkeeper. You've got business development. You got mentors. But ultimately, if you're trying to scale your business, what would you tell businesses that are startups that are trying to start or grow their business? What advice would you give them in terms of what to look for when you're trying to grow? Because it's not. I mean, I've said this before. It's not a straight line. No. There's a lot of zigging and zagging, and you kind of go, geez, that didn't work. Or even if it's on the same general theme. Maybe talk about that. Like what's the advice you get in terms of being, getting to that end state, which is growth, because it's not a straight line.
So I'm going to answer that for a human component and then an entrepreneur component, because I think those are two very different things. The human component is find someone who's going to tell you you're wrong. Mm-hmm. Find someone who's going to tell you no a lot, and find someone who's going to be your version of lead shoes. The reason is a lot of people around you, especially friends or family or even some consultants, business centers, they are excited that you're going to launch something. They're excited that you get to run a business. They're excited for you. And so you can bring them the most ridiculous harebrained scheme, and they are going to be excited and happy and support you.
And even not though that critical.
You got it.
Yeah.
So I find that anytime that we're starting out a relationship with somebody new, I intentionally bring them a scheme that I am never going to try. And if they don't tell me that it's a bad idea, then I know that that's probably not somebody that is going to trust to give me accurate advice. So that is my first one, is make sure you surround yourself with people that will tell you no. It's very, very easy to get down a rabbit hole of what you think is a really good idea, and you're off base. The second thing, and I hammer on this with every single one of the calls that I get for starting a business, is you don't start the business, you start with data. The challenge with all growth is a question of, is what I'm doing causal or correlated to the success? And I'll give you a fantastic example of exactly, if we go back to that conversation about our sampling program. We found that the growth that we were experiencing with the sampling was not necessarily there. And it might be for some other brands, but I would challenge them to ask the question of, is that causal growth or just correlated? If you are sampling, people are obviously going to purchase from you while you're sampling, right? If your customers are purchasing from you while you're there, that might be because they like you. It might be because they're in the mindset, any of 100 different things. So as you do things in your business, what you have to dive into and create these data feedback loops to figure out what you're doing is either causal or correlated. And if it's correlated, then it means you might have something that works, but you shouldn't trust to be able to do that over and over and over again. Businesses actually probably can have a very straight line between what they're doing and the success if they have perfect data. No one ever has perfect data, and that's why there's so much zigging and zagging, is because they're doing something over here and it turns out they don't, it's causal, and so it works. And then the next time they do it, something has changed and it turns out it wasn't actually causal, it was just correlated.
I think, the important part out there is the data speaks for itself. You have to look at it dispassionately and not try and put rose-colored glasses to review. The numbers are the numbers, and the data will guide you if you're prepared to follow it.
I would take that a step further and try and defeat yourself with the data. Fantastic example of this, again, if we use our sampling program as a net result, the data that we were getting from our retail partners indicated that our sales were going up because of our sampling. And then when we looked at the way that they put that data together, it turns out that they were including the sales of the day of sampling in the second half of that data. But if I'm there selling it, obviously we're going to sell more. So when you actually removed the sales of our samplers, the sales across the board were flat. But the way that they were putting the data together colored it to indicate that we'd actually had about a 30% lift. We had no lift, but when you package it in such a way that includes the wrong things, then the data that you're being fed might be colored. So try and challenge where those sources are and how they're putting it together too.
So cast your eyes ahead. So you've come from university idea, you're growing the business, you've had some growth, you've had a great relationship with BDC, your market is growing, you're expanding lines. What do you see the business going in the next, 10 years is a long time out, but I mean, the idea is that you're growing a business. Where do you see this going over the next 10 years?
So I'm hoping it won't take 10 years, but I'm hoping that we'll find a major orchard partner that will take this past what we can do it. In my estimation, most agriculture at this stage is multi-generational. There's no real reason for what we're doing to be multi-generational. I don't think that any bookkeepers or lawyers or accountants that I would hire are going to be better than another orchard's bookkeepers or lawyers or accountants. The warehouses I would build are not going to be any better than someone else's warehouses. So what I'm actually really hoping for here is another multi-generational partner will step in looking for fresh ideas, fresh market share, fresh concepts, fresh content, and fresh approach, and absorb us into what that is as a mutual beneficial partnership. So they get
a new brand, or a new product, which is a specialty line.
Yep.
And your opening state, or context is to keep crab apples alive.
Yes.
A big partner is probably the best way to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. We're not probably going to be able to
scale it.
I mean, the question is what is scale? If we plant 10 acres and we do 10 million in sales, is it scale? I mean, it would make me happy, but it doesn't necessarily matter. What we really want out of this is something that's going to last 20 or 50 or 250 years.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about it that way, what we're actually looking for is a forward-thinking partner, because what is special is the apple. What is special is the IP. What is special is the way that we're doing this. That's what's special. The actual warehouses that products sit in, we don't need to go down the rabbit hole of 20 years of slowly building that physical infrastructure.
All right, we're almost out of time. Always the podcast is around telling stories of entrepreneurs and things that are important to the community, but it's also about leadership. And you're leading a new organization, and so I was asked these same three questions because I'm always fascinated on how people kind of where they take this. So if I was to say, what would you tell your younger self with the benefit of if you had a rear view mirror and could go back and tell your younger self something, what would it be?
Use more data. Probably. We spent years doing things that really don't actually help work. So I would start those projects earlier, and I would take my feelings out of it as to what I think is right. So that's a really big part of it, number one. Number two is the right partner is better than a number of wrong partners. Whether that's financial, whether that's business support, what you really don't want is a cheerleader or a mixed matched fit.
Yeah.
And it's better to wait, I think, is a really big one. And then I think the last thing I would say is this is just going to take a lot longer than you think. When we walked into it, we thought 3 years, no problem, someone will take us seriously. It's not. It's just not. People are really good at what they do. And so your competitors in any business are good at what they do. So understand it'll just take time.
I like the idea of being dispassionate and following the data, because we always talk about entrepreneurs being passionate. And I think you got to keep the passion, but when it comes to data, is be dispassionate. Okay. Everyone learns lessons a variety of different ways. What's the greatest lesson you've ever learned?
Innovation is hard. And you do not need to innovate to have a really successful business. Do not think you need to do something differently. There is nothing wrong with Dawn's peanut butter cookies, even if somebody else also has peanut butter cookies. You don't actually need to totally reinvent the wheel. You just have to be really good at executing Dawn's cookies. And that's really all you need, right?
Yeah. I think that's good advice. I mean, there's not everything is a new widget. It can be an iteration of something that already exists. Okay, final question. Who or what inspires you along your path?
That's a good question, because there's a lot of little things that I find to be really helpful as opposed to one kind of overarching thing. Who inspires me? People that work a job for 45 years to provide for their family. I am in a position where I get to take the risks of trying to do this because I had a pretty decent education. I have family that really support me. That's fun. It means I get to take risks and try and push the boundaries of what we can do here. There are a lot of people that don't have the ability or the opportunity to take those risks. So I have a huge amount of respect for those who not only can't necessarily take these risks, but still want to be celebrated in that same way. I'm starting on third base and talking about going around a home. So huge points to those who start at home or start at first to get one base ahead. That's
a great place to leave it. Listen, Glenn, thanks so much for spending time today. I know, the life of a small business owner and entrepreneur, time is probably your most precious commodity of many precious commodities. So thank you for spending some of that with us today. And thanks once again to our title sponsor, Manulife, our presenting sponsor, BDC, and our supporting sponsor, the Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region.